right, hi everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm a science fiction author and creative writing mentor. And I'm spending these few sessions just talking about world building and spec fic. So in the last session, I was looking at how writers can really kind of dig into structures of power and authority and governance, and what sort of questions you want to ask yourself as you're starting to unpack those spoken and unspoken rules that make your spec fic world turn. This today is going to be the second of my 3Ps, what I call the 3Ps of spec fic world building. So the first one's power, this one's place, and the next one's going to be population. So this session, as I say, I'm going to be looking at place. So just like with the previous session, what I'm trying to do is to get you thinking about the kind of questions you need to ask yourself about geography, environment, climate, that sort of thing as you're starting to build your world. And again, I've divided the questions into 5 main sections. So I'm going to suggest some kind of key considerations under each of them. Ultimately, there are so many more questions that you can be asking yourself as you're starting to kind of solidify your understanding of the world's environment. These are just really to get you started. So let's start by looking at the first category, and we're going really broad here. So understanding the environment, I did say broad. So we'll start by giving ourselves a general overview of the environment of your world. So if you took part in the second workshop, so last Friday's workshop, which was creating a lived-in spec fic setting, you'll know that one of the things I like to say about spec fic world building is there is no such thing as a desert planet. But the same holds true for smaller societies as well as the really large sort of planet-wide or even galactic societies. Maybe your novel is set in a kind of futuristic city state or a space station or an underground bunker, something like that. You may not have specifically geographical diversity in those spaces, though you might, but it doesn't mean that each setting is kind of identical from corner to corner nonetheless. It's the nuance that we're looking for. It's the small differences and even the very subtle ones. And these are what make this imaginary space feel as though it comes to life. So I do think that's worth bearing in mind as you're gathering your information about the environment in which your spec fic story takes place. So a few questions to ask yourself. Now, as I say, there's no such thing as a desert planet, but that's not really what this question is getting at. I know it might look like it is, but it's not really what it's getting at. This is a sort of a foundational question, and it's inviting you to consider things like the overall atmosphere or mood of your world. Again, if you remember back to the second session, if you were there, we talked about personality. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Have you got a world that you would describe as vibrant and bustling, or maybe it's desolate and foreboding? Maybe you would call it harsh and unforgiving. Maybe you'd call it innocent, welcoming. So it's not really nuances of geography and climate here, although you could definitely be describing nuances of geography and climate. But it's more about the tone that helps establish a mood that can kind of permeate your story. So if, for example, if I were to talk about my first novel, Edge of Heaven, the novel takes place in a couple of settings. Predominantly, it takes place in a dark and dangerous city called Creobas. It also takes place in a kind of harsh and arid nature preserve and this sort of coolie clinical space station and a kind of a rich guy's pleasure garden and a failing farmstead. But dark and dangerous is the predominant tone, and the environment of all those other locations follows suit. So no matter that they're quite different in physical, geographic, climatic, and so on, all those features, dark and dangerous is the overarching tone that we would use to kind of understand the geography of those other spaces. So if you think about sensory details for this question, what do the characters see, hear, smell, feel, and so on? What are the kind of colors you might associate with the world? What emotions, and so on? What are the differences in environments? So now we're getting into the specifically physical features. So like I say, this is my hill that I will die on. Diversity in environments is crucial for creating a believable world. So what are the various geographical features? You know, the mountains, the forests, the oceans that exist on your world. You don't need to draw a map or anything. You just need to kind of think it through, because this will have an impact on the cultures and the societies and so on that live there. How do these environments on your world influence things like social structures, economies, even belief systems? You're getting into a lot of crossover here. We will talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about population, so the next session. But the 3Ps are always very closely interconnected anyway. How do the environment and geography affect daily life for inhabitants? So you want to try and integrate environmental factors into your characters' experiences. So for example, how does living in a mountainous region impact things like transportation, trade, even food availability? You might want to consider how geography shapes things like lifestyle choices. Are communities self-sustaining, or are they absolutely reliant on trade in order to get by? One of my favourite logical extrapolations happened from this line of questioning when I was writing my second novel, On the Brink. So it's set on an orbital settlement where water is a far, far more valuable commodity than, say, for example, something like alcohol, because the sheer volume of water that's required to keep the city running, versus how much alcohol somebody can realistically consume without giving themselves poisoning. There's a vast difference in those two quantities. And since both of them are liquids that have to be shipped specifically from Earth regardless, because there's no naturally occurring water in space, the one that's going to be in highest demand is going to be water. So QED, you go to a bar on my orbital settlement and only fancy people drink water there, because only fancy people can afford to drink water when they go out for drinks and chat. So you really can have fun with some of these things if you think them through to their logical conclusion. What natural resources are available and how do they influence culture or economy? Again, no natural water sources in space, so there's an answer to that one. But, you might not be writing about an orbital settlement. But, no matter where your novel takes place, natural resources play a pivotal role in shaping societies. So we're considering here what kinds of resources exist within your world and how that plays out. So, for example, gold is valuable on Earth because it's relatively rare here, but it's not super useful for stuff. It's soft and it's quite heavy. What if gold was the metal that's relatively common on your world, though? It's really tough to build a spaceship out of gold. It's not useful for very many things. It's more good at being pretty. What if aluminium, for example, was the rare metal on your world? How does that influence how the society develops? And how does resource availability impact things like economies and power dynamics? Are there conflicts over resource control? How does resource scarcity drive things like innovation or adaptation among populations? There's a lot to get into here. This is very much a kind of jumping off question. And are there any significant geographical features that shape societies? So I remember years ago I was reading about when Terry Pratchett was putting together the published map of the Discworld. Anybody remember that one? And I was reading they got an actual cartographer in to give it, a look and just check that everything made sense. I'm probably going to get lots of stuff wrong with this story because I'm doing it from memory. But what I remember is that the cartographer looked at where they'd placed the Great Neff Desert on this map of the Discworld and just went, nah, that doesn't work. This is the driest landscape on the disc, the famously driest landscape on the disc, and you guys have placed it in the rain shadow of a massive mountain range. There's no way it could possibly be as dry as you need it to be. So kind of what I'm getting at is, geographical features they're more than just like imagery. They're contradictory. They have unexpected consequences. Volcanoes, phenomenally destructive geographical feature, but they also create incredible farmland. Mountains, well, they block trade, but they also protect against invasions and things like that. Rivers facilitate transport, again, and trade, but they also flood. So how do these features influence the way your societies have grown and developed? Who wants to live where and why do they want to live there? And what does that mean for your world? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so what are the seasons like and how do they impact life on your world? So seasonality is one of the ways that we can really start unpacking what makes this space feel real and lived in. And, we can look at, for example, places even on our planet where the seasons don't really behave the way we'd expect them to. It always adds character, personality to that place. So San Francisco, for example, summers in San Francisco are often cool and wet, and there's what we'd consider a kind of unseasonably warm period in early autumn. Mark Twain, apparently, it's probably apocryphal, but it's credited to him saying, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." So seasonality weaves its way into the daily lives of anybody who's affected by those seasons. Look at how resigned we are to miserly rain in these parts. But look at how quickly we lose all sense of ourselves whenever there's a warm spell, or how everything just kind of goes up the left. If there's even a moderately heavy fall of snow, it influences all parts of our daily lives, and it affects cultural activities as well. So most places that have like a long dark winter, they have some kind of midwinter celebration, for example. So how do your characters adapt their lifestyles to the changing seasons? What kind of traditions or rituals emerge as a result? These are the kind of questions you can be asking yourself. So your characters may not experience any kind of extreme weather event in the course of your narrative. And there's no need for that to happen just because it's a possibility. But if they do live in a world where it's possible, that's the sort of information that affects behavior. So it is important to know about what is possible, whether or not it's actually something that's going to happen. So, for example, people who live in a tornado-prone area, they might have homes that incorporate an underground refuge of some sort. People who live in flood-prone areas, they might have homes that are raised up above ground level and so on. And this question can help you consider ways in which extreme weather events might shape society as well. So do they lead to things like migration or conflict or struggles for resources or shifts in power dynamics? You can have so much fun with unique weather phenomena. Trust me, I've done it. It's great. It's an absolute delight for the speculative side of your speculative world building. You get to think creatively and start to extrapolate from the specifics of your world here. This might be one to park and return to periodically as you get more information about the world at large. You might not want to. You might want to just do this as at the opening section of your planning, because, as I said, it's so much fun. And I, for one, would be more inclined to make my world fit the cool thing that I've come up with, rather than the other way around, to create the world and then try and work out what cool things it might incorporate. I think go with the cool thing first and make it fit. Inhabitants and their climate. So yeah, adaptation is key to survival in any environment. You'll want to explore how your character's society has developed things like technologies, what practices they've developed, what social structures they've developed in response to the conditions, the climatic conditions that they find themselves in. They'll have some very specific skills and knowledge that are adapted to living in this environment, because that's how they thrive. So what are those skills? What is that knowledge? Now, this is connected, of course, to the next big topic, universal laws. And what universal laws do we have in play in this world? Now, by definition, speculative fiction is fiction that departs from reality as we understand it. So to some degree, whatever world you're building, it's going to involve some kind of departure from the universal laws as we currently understand them. It might be slight, it might be infinitesimal. But the point is, it doesn't just apply if you're breaking conventional physics. It's worth considering, even superficially, what kind of universal laws are at play for something like a near future sci-fi set on Earth, where it's really not a huge amount of difference, but something is going to be different. So is it set in this universe or another with different universal laws at play? So this is the big one. And I am cheating here slightly by using the word universe to refer interchangeably both to our actual universe in which we live, and the kind of story universe, which might take place, at least nominally, in our actual universe, but with slightly different laws at play. That's a difficult concept to try and get across in language. I hope you're following me. Basically, what the question is designed to do is to get you to establish the basic framework of your world. If it's set in our universe, story or otherwise, you'll have to consider how existing scientific principles apply. Alternatively, if it's a fictional universe, you can obviously bend Newtonian and Einsteinian physics however you please, but you do need to know what your new rules are for things like, say, gravity, matter, time, and so on. And do please remember the law of unintended consequences. My maxim for when I am bending universal laws is to always ask myself, if this is true, what else is true? It's a great maxim to live by, and it helps you avoid kind of inadvertently breaking the universe and digging yourself a plot hole with one of your narrative devices. Okay, so following on from that, what are these laws, if so? So you'll need to be able to articulate, at least broadly, the specific laws that govern the world. This could involve reimagining your physical laws. Maybe gravity fluctuates in a certain area, or time flows differently in different regions. If you think about Terry Pratchett's Discworld, light flows more slowly in a magical field. I love that. I'm not sure that that's ever fully played out to its logical conclusion, but I love that as a concept. How do the laws of the universe affect characters' abilities? How do they affect things like societal structures and technological advancements? I mean, a magical society probably has less use for technology than a non-magical society, but where are the limits to that? Why? Or alternatively, if you're bending this universe's laws, in what way? So again, in my second novel, On the Brink, I have these orbital cities circling the Earth, and I was trying to follow established science as closely as possible. I want these cities to feel as though they could really be a logical outcome of our current activities where we are in the 21st century. But it's really hard to make these things work at scale with our current understanding of the laws of the universe. So I wibbled slightly, and I invented a controllable black hole. And then I kind of needed to work out how that worked. So I have more pages of notes than I should really admit to on this, considering it's a plot device that's referenced no more than a handful of times in the whole novel. But I know what laws I've broken, bent, not broken. And I kind of sort of mostly know how I've done it. And I know what the laws are around how it can be used. Now, I don't know if it passed the sniff test for a quantum physicist. I very much doubt it. I've never dared to ask. But, we're only nominally in this universe, in my story universe. So I get to bend those rules as long as I understand that I'm doing it and how I'm doing it. Okay, does your world have magic? This is a big question, huge question. Personally, I don't tend to write fantasy, but I've worked with a lot of writers who do, and my advice to them is always the same. Get a handle on the rules of your magic system as it applies to your universe, even before you get a handle on your plot, if possible. Magic is a staple of the fantasy genre for excellent reasons. It would be amazing if we could use magic, but it's so easy to trip yourself up if you don't establish your parameters right from the get-go. So if you remember the old Pixar rule, you can use coincidence to get your protagonist into trouble, but you can't use coincidence to get them out of trouble. If we substitute magic for coincidence, well, you see, you can't really use magic as a kind of deus ex machina, get out of jail free card, or else you have no basis for narrative conflict. And if you allow magic to be governed by what your plot needs at any given moment, then you risk your reader asking the wrong question at a pivotal moment. Why don't they just use a spell? It worked before. Why can't they use a spell here? So you probably do want to spend some time and energy on working out exactly what your magic can and can't do so that you know this really from the first page. Okay, now I really am going to start picking up the pace a bit. Let's look at settlement patterns. Okay. Are people clustered in large cities? Are they spread out in small villages? Do they live nomadically? Is it a mixture? Is it something different? And each type of settlement has its own implications for things like culture, governance, daily life. Urban centres might foster innovation, while rural communities might be more about relationships and maybe traditional working of the land and that sort of thing. Generalising wildly, but I hope you know what I mean. On our planet, for example, there was a huge shift in the way humans interact with humans and knowledge and ideas of personhood and so on when we started leaving the countryside in droves and moving into large cities. So it does have an impact on how society is structured. What's the technology level? So this connects to the questions I was suggesting you should ask yourself about knowledge and access to knowledge and power structures in your world in the last session. If there are technological disparities between populations, it's a good idea to understand what's behind this. I mean, it could be geography for sure. Resources could be scarce in places, but there's potentially a lot of nuance behind that answer, and that poses a whole lot of other important questions. It could also be that culturally certain populations in your world have less desire for technology. Maybe they're actively avoiding it, prioritizing nature, for example. But then there's tensions. What tensions arise from those differences? How do characters navigate those social structures? So coastal cities, they'll typically thrive on things like trade, fishing, maritime activities, tourism. The architecture there will be adapted to saltwater conditions, which can be very harsh on a lot of different materials. Desert towns, on the other hand, they'll have architecture that's adapted to strong sunlight, low precipitation. A desert settlement will often be organised around water management systems, wells, irrigation channels, and this will be a necessary part of supporting life there, so it'll be absolutely central. Customs will probably be centred around things like the varying heat of the day, or water conservation, or resource management, and so on. And then finally, the big one here, geopolitics. This is obviously much bigger than we could hope to cover in one short slide, but here's a few questions to get you started. So, how does geography affect political boundaries or power struggles? Right, so you've got natural features such as mountains, rivers, deserts. These could be barriers that separate populations, or they could potentially create zones of contention where resources are more abundant and everyone wants to own that land. So how do things like geographical factors inform things like territorial claims or alliances or conflicts between different groups? It's a huge question. This is one to spend a bit of time on for sure. Are there resources that create conflict between populations or factions? I mean, of course there are, but what are they? What resources are scarce in this world? You know, water, minerals, fertile land, rare metals, food sources, that sort of thing. How does that availability influence relationships between groups? I mean, I've been writing a lot of solar punk recently, so I'd suggest you could potentially go completely anarchic here and have them create bonds of friendship and cooperation, but I'd venture to suggest that that's not usually the way this plays out in narrative fiction. Geographical location, it directly influences things like trade routes and economic strength. So say you're setting your story in a coastal settlement, maritime trade is probably a big part of their past or current prosperity because of the access to the sea. Inland communities will rely on land-based routes to connect them with other regions. But if either land or sea becomes more risky as a trade route for whatever reason, then you've got a society that needs to find another option. And then potentially you've got another society that holds a lot of power all of a sudden because of that, because they have access to the less risky options. So how does that shape hierarchies and power structures and within and between settlements? How do trade relationships affect alliance or rivalries? On the most basic level, what goods are even traded and so on? And then finally, although, I mean, you could definitely add to this list as even more so than some of the others, are the historical events tied to geographic changes? So, I mean, you could have a geographic change due to a natural disaster, like a volcanic eruption, or you could have it due to things like human activities that cause urban expansion. It can have profound implications for societies. And any society that's been around for, for long enough has almost certainly experienced something along those lines. So, you know, maybe there was a drought that caused crops to fail, led to migration, as we see, and a blight in Ireland leading to the Irish famine. Maybe there's a volcano that buried a city. I mean, you'd think perhaps that would lead to no more cities in that area, but of course it doesn't mean that. It means rich, fertile agricultural land, and now you've got a new society or societies in that space that's running out the clock effectively on an almost inevitable disaster. Look at Naples, for example. So the question then becomes, how does this shape cultural memory? How does it influence the political landscape? How does it alter population distributions? How does it shape things like cultural identity? Anyway, that is an absolute whistle-stop tour of one of my very favourite parts of world building. I do have some questions. How long does it take you to write a novel? Oh my goodness, that's a great question, Annie. So how long's a piece of string? I have novels that I wrote in a couple of months. I have a novel that I am still writing 3 years after starting it because I cannot get the stupid thing to work. My first novel, I wrote the first draft of it when I was 15. It didn't get published until I was 37. So that's 22 years on that. I do tend to spend a lot of time on planning, not compared to writing. I mean, I'll try and put a limit on the planning time because that can expand to encompass however long I need it to. And it's one of the great ways that writers convince ourselves that we're working on our novels when in fact we're actually stuck in the planning phase because it's a bit scary to move out of that and move into the actual writing phase. It depends on so many different factors that I don't think that anybody could give you a definite answer for that, because some people are going to have a lot of time and ability to write huge chunks in one go. Other writers, they're going to be time constrained, or their process is going to work best if they are just doing short bursts. So ultimately, if we think about a novel as being anywhere between 80 to 100,000 words, it's a reasonable estimate, or I think, or a low estimate, I suppose, is if you can manage to do about 500 words per week. A lot of writers will be able to do a lot more than that. But I think 500 words a week is the kind of low pressure target that if you've got other commitments in your life, and everybody does, then that should be easily achievable. I mean, I try to do a lot more than that, but 500 words, you're probably looking at a couple of years at least. But that, it's not a race. There's no deadline, and ultimately you should take as long as you need to write that novel and not feel pressured to do it faster or slower. Do you decide if your novel is good or your publisher? Me personally, or writers in general, Clive? So generally speaking, I will be chatting to my agent about my ideas for a novel, and I'll get his take on it before I start writing in the first place. The two novels that I've had published with Newcom Press, I sold those on spec. So I mean, I guess there comes a point where you have to kind of let go. You'll always, always, always see the flaws in your novel. But so it becomes almost a question of just, right, this is the point where we have to stop. I've done as much as I can. And good is such a slippery concept. I mean, I would never be categorizing a novel in development as good, bad, or indifferent. There are novels that could do with some more work from the author, but then there are novels that I feel like have a lot more work to go that have been published and found huge audiences, and I'm not going to name them because this is being recorded, so I'm not going on the record with that. So I mean, ultimately, I think by good we mean publishable, and the only person who can decide if it's publishable is the person giving you the publishing contract. So if we take the question to mean that, I guess it's the publisher that makes that decision. How do you go from writing your first book to getting it published? There's no one path to doing that. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer at all, but really the best way of doing it is to write a lot, to read a lot, and just to keep sending it out. It doesn't necessarily help or hinder to have other publication credits, but I do think it's useful for writers to, if you are the sort of writer that feels comfortable writing short stories, and sending them out. It gives you publication credits, which, it's always good to have. But I think the importance for that is to validate for you, yourself, your ability as an author as much as anything else. Really, it's tenacity is the bottom line, is just to keep on going. And it's easy to say that, when you set out, you will get rejections. You will absolutely get rejections, and it hurts, and it doesn't ever stop hurting. But picking yourself up and just keeping on going, and holding on to the idea that it's a marathon, not a race. Ultimately, there's decisions that you have to make. Do you want to go down the traditional publishing route? Are you going to self-publish? I'm not the person to talk to you about self-publishing. I've never done that, but it's a perfectly valid route, and there's a lot of reasons to consider that. Do you want to have an agent? You go about it in exactly the same way as you go about finding a publisher. It's just another step in the process. So bottom line, I would advise getting a copy of the Writer and Artist's Yearbook, or signing up to their online database where you can search for agents and publishers who are actively searching for the kind of work that you're writing. And then you just keep approaching them. Most of them you can approach multiples at a time. It used to be the case that you had to do it one by one and wait for them to give you an answer, which is incredibly time consuming and a bit crazy. These days, most of them are perfectly happy for you to be approaching multiples at a time, and you just keep going. As I say, the key difference in my experience between a published author and an unpublished author is tenacity, just refusing to quit.